Couple of seconds.
Hi, I'm Tom Babor. Is Denny on? Looks like she hasn't joined yet.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, she is.
a few more logging on, so just another second.
Yeah, I've logged in as Denny.
All right, well, I have 2:01 Eastern Time, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. It's been a little while since we've done one of these more general wrap-ups of what's going on over the last couple of weeks. And so I'll reference a couple of things that we may have talked about in the past and bring you up to speed on a few things. But for anyone who might be new, I'm Wendy Noss. I'm Executive Director of the Consortium of Social Science Associations in Washington, D.C. And this is a members-only webinar, so welcome to all of you. And the rest of our team is here as well, Elise, Kenzie, and Anne, and they'll be helping out throughout with the chat and with questions later on. So here's the plan for today. Obviously, there is no shortage of topics for our community to discuss, but we cannot do it all in an hour. And so I wanted to provide a brief update on the latest executive actions, executive orders, talk about where we are with respect to science funding, and then end on a positive note with a new resource that you get to see first, because just finished it this morning. If you have other topics, other questions, there should be time at the end, so please feel free. If you're subscribed to the COSSA Washington Update, you know that we cover everything we can as it relates to Congress, the administration, science policy, science funding, from indirect cost rates to you name it, peer review process, and so on. So please feel free to ask other questions that we don't cover today. All right. So first, recent executive actions. There are actually two that I wanted to bring to your attention. One, we've talked about already in the past, but it's continuing to develop. And then one that happened in August when we were on August break. And so we hadn't talked to you about this one yet. On the COSSA website is a listing to all of the executive orders that we've been following closely. It's not all executive orders, but all the research related ones are on our website, and some of them have separate write-ups, so you can get more information there. But let's start with gold standard science. So this is an executive order from back in the spring. And you've probably heard about it. You've also probably been hearing federal agency people using the terminology gold standard science. It's part of the talking points now for federal agencies. The intent behind this executive order was essentially to return US science policies and regulations back to the pre-Biden days. So undoing a lot of the executive actions from the last administration, but also really with a target on DEI, other quote unquote objectionable research, and using different research enterprise regulations and procedures to prevent additional funding for topics that this administration finds objectionable. So if you read the executive order, it reads like something you wouldn't necessarily disagree with in some respects. In others, it says that the US science enterprise is failing because there's a reproducibility crisis, because there's a history of falsifying data and highly misleading research. That's all code for things that the administration doesn't think is a priority or doesn't support taxpayer funding for. But on the side of what you would think on paper seems to be pretty reasonable are the tenets of what gold standard science is. So it should be reproducible and unbiased peer review. You should have academic freedom to study what you'd like and not have conflicts of interest and all of these tenets that have been around forever. But the objection following the release of the executive order is that the actions of the administration are not following the executive order, and what they say are priorities. So, for example, the politicization of science we're seeing all across the government, that runs afoul of several of these tenets. So there's a disconnect between the gold standard science, what the administration says it is, but then how they're actually interpreting it and using it to control what the federal government spends its money on. Now, the new item here is that as part of that executive order, the administration called on the Office of Science and Technology Policy to develop guidance for federal agencies. And that guidance came out in June. And it required that federal science agencies create implementation plans that they'll update once a year on how they are either already addressing those tenets of gold standard science or how they plan to going forward. And so recently, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen those plans come out, and they are required to be publicly available. So they are available on the NSF website, NIH website, Energy, NASA, and USDA, and there may be others as well. And so those are publicly available for you to see. What's really interesting about these is they all take different forms, and some of them are very, very short, and others are a little bit longer. But they largely talk about what activities the agencies are already doing and then fitting them into one of the tenets. So it remains to be seen, how disruptive this will all be to the actual programming of the agencies. But I thought you might find it interesting to check out those implementation plans so you can at least see how the agencies are saying they are responding to gold standard science. And this isn't going to go away. That is going to be in the talking points for the administration for the foreseeable future. And no doubt, as we get into next year's budget discussions, it'll be all over the budget request for next year too. So just a quick update on that one. The other executive order that I wanted to bring up, so we haven't talked about this one yet because it happened over the summer break, but you may have heard of it from other organizations or your universities or potentially in the news. This is a pretty big one, and it has a lot of pieces to it. This was released in August, and as you can see, there's a quote on the screen. This one is a lot less guarded in expressing what it actually means through this executive order, while the gold standard science one was saying all the right things, but interpreting it in bad ways. This one is pretty upfront with what they find objectionable. So the idea behind this executive order is to put structures in place at federal agencies, namely political structures in place to be extra checks on what funding opportunities are available and then what ultimately gets funded by the federal government. And you can see on the screen some of the things that does not include. So, for example, as part of this process, each agency is supposed to designate a senior appointee, which is a political appointee, so not a technical expert or a scientific expert in a certain field. And this should be a non-career person, so really a political appointee. And their their job is to review all new funding opportunity announcements before they're even issued to make sure that they are aligned with the administration's priorities. So this is a really, really big change. And they are to make sure that the awards are consistent with agency priorities and what they call the national interests, but they don't define what national interests means. So this means that no new funding opportunities can come out of a federal science agency until this political appointee or their designee has reviewed it and has given it the okay. So not only would that create, additional bottlenecks, but also adds this very explicit layer of political review to even just getting the funding opportunities out the door. Now, when it comes to the awards themselves, this is where things get even dicier. When an agency is deciding to fund an award, it must demonstrably advance the president's policy priorities. And they're very explicit about what that does not include. So it does not include projects related to race preference, awardees who deny that there are two sexes or that sex is a chosen or mutable characteristic, illegal immigration, and other, quote, anti-American values, which is not defined. So if you're looking at the National Science Foundation and you're familiar with the programs there over its 75-year history, you can see how disruptive this is potentially. What my understanding from reading all of this is we've all witnessed over the last several months the court battles with respect to terminated grants. And in my reading of this, this is an effort by the administration to get around the court orders. So I'll say more about that in a second. This is a pretty sweeping executive order. So other pieces include giving preference for funding to institutions with lower indirect cost rates. That is a hot topic right now, and happy to talk more about that. And explicitly says that peer review recommendations remain advisory. They've always been advisory, but we all know if you've served on a review panel, especially at NIH, the reviews really, I think, weigh heavily on whether something is funded or not. The executive order really explains that that is one piece that we'll be considering, but that there are all of these other political considerations going into a decision of what's to be funded. So here is where we get to the terminated grants and the court cases over the last year. So the executive order would require that all discretionary grants that they can be terminated for convenience. And so that means no longer advances agency priorities or the national interest, not defined. So any new funding opportunity announcement coming out of a federal science agency must include termination for convenience clauses. In addition, it calls for each agency to revise its current terms and conditions for existing awards that are still funded right now to change the terms and conditions to permit immediate termination for convenience. So to my earlier point, we have the courts saying, no, you can't terminate these grants because the terms and conditions or whatever reason, now they're saying, okay, well, we're going to add that language into existing grants and future grants terms and conditions, which means we can cancel whatever we don't like. Obviously, very, very problematic. So what's next? This is an executive order. And so if you've listened in the past, you know that executive orders have limitations. There are things that they can do and things that they cannot. They cannot change law, but they are intended for internal government operations. So there are some things that can be implemented through this executive order unless Congress acts. So it's really important that the community, and I'll show examples of this in a minute, continue to engage with Congress, not just on funding levels, but on policies such as these that come out, because as you'll see in a second, advocacy does work. They just need to hear from us. So, it remains to be seen what's going to go on with this executive order exactly. It's only been, a month or a little over a month, and agencies are trying to figure out, how to implement some of this. But in the meantime, Congress is working through its appropriations bills and including language in their bills that are directing the agencies to do other things. So there's a lot sort of on the table right now that needs to get sorted out over the next couple of months. So I wanted to turn to funding and where things are, because it's a good example of how Congress, even though the Republicans control both chambers and the White House, still are using their power to push against administration proposals and policies. So last time we met back in early summer, we talked to you about the president's budget request, which had just come out. So that's the picture on the screen. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but encourage you to go back and watch that webinar if you have questions, and certainly read our document. It goes into a lot of information on specific agencies. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to talk about two appropriations bills that the science community follows. The CJS bill, which funds NSF, Justice, Census, a bunch of statistical agencies, and the Labor HHS, which Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and some statistical agencies as well. Those are the two bills. There are 12 appropriations bills that have to pass every year. And when you see a big omnibus or a big package at the end of the year, that's them bundling them all together in order to pass them. But, throughout the process, the bills are written individually. And so we pay attention to those two and others from time to time, like agriculture or defense. But the bulk of science funding comes from these two bills. So I show this table all the time to show you where we should be versus where we are. So right now, in the process, the new fiscal year starts October 1st. That's a week away. And we are, in terms of the process, somewhere around here, where the House and Senate haven't voted on the bills we care about yet. And so we're nowhere near them conferencing or reconciling the differences between their bills. But we do have details of what's in their bills. So a lot of the discussion right now is on, will the government shut down next week? And that is still an open question. I just saw that the president canceled his meeting with Senate Democrats, which was supposed to happen this week, or congressional Democrats, to come up with a game plan for passing a continuing resolution to avert a government shutdown. The Senate is out this week, so when they come back next week, they have 2 days to figure out how to not shut down the government. Our prediction is there will be a continuing resolution at some point. Whether we shut down before that or not remains to be seen. But the proposal on the table right now is a continuing resolution until around Thanksgiving, which would give another couple of months to finish this process. But don't be surprised if funding isn't completed until next calendar year, as we saw this past year with 2025 funding. So I'm going to go into some details about what is in the bills, but keep in mind that this process is far from over. Before we can even get to enacting any of the provisions I'm going to talk about in these bills, we have to get through avoiding a government shutdown, passing a continuing resolution to keep the government going, and then House and Senate have to come to agreement on what the actual numbers are. We, over the last couple of months, we put out analysis on the two bills when the House and the Senate passed them and released their details. So here is a screenshot of our analysis of the NSF Census Justice bill, House and Senate. We wrote those up together. And then the NIH bill, the labor HHS bill. We have two separate write-ups, one that we put out just this week, or last week, from the House. Now I'm bringing all of this up because, as I hinted earlier, there is quite a bit of pushback coming from the Republican Congress to the proposals made in the president's budget request. As I said, advocacy works. There is a reason why the House and Senate completely rejected the president's proposals for the National Institutes of Health, as you can see in the table. Similar, you can say for NSF. NSF would still see a cut in the House, but the fact that it does not cut as far as the president would have liked should be considered a major win in this environment. Again, we don't know what the final numbers are going to be, but at least this tells us that in many cases, not in all, because there are some accounts that are still problematic, that we can work with this Congress to get to a solution and final numbers that we can work with. So I want to show a few agency-specific examples of how the Congress is pushing back. So looking at the National Science Foundation, for example, you can see the budget numbers there and how they differ. And then there are some specifics. So the president's budget request proposed cutting the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate by 2/3. The House bill doesn't mention the directorate, and it's important to note that Congress doesn't appropriate specific funding levels for the NSF directorates. They appropriate a chunk of money to NSF, and then NSF decides how to fund it. But knowing that the administration wants deep cuts to social science at NSF, language was put in the Senate bill requiring that the SBE directorate receive at least the 2024 level. So saying no to the 68% cut, but also SBE cannot be the bank for plussing up accounts in other areas at the agency. So that's important. Now, this is report language. And so report language is tricky because it's just in the Senate version. There will be report language usually in the final bill, whatever that is. And so we have to see if you have a House bill and a Senate bill and they have differing language on the same topic, which one do they pull into the final bill? So this is something we'll be pushing for, obviously. The president's proposal essentially sought to shutter the STEM Education Directorate at NSF and roll the directorate into the more general research account with the other directorates. Right now, it's funded separately by Congress. And so the House bill accepts the reorganization, not necessarily the closing of EDU. But the Senate bill rejects the president's proposal altogether and would fund the STEM Education Directorate as it always has been. So that's a pretty big rejection. Similarly, the president's budget zeroed out dozens of STEM education programs, including Minority Serving Institution, HBCU, other programs related to the scientific pipeline, getting people into STEM early, zeroed out most of those that aren't congressionally mandated, and even some that are congressionally mandated. The House bill does not endorse that. In fact, they gently object by saying, well, we do like these programs that were terminated, so we think you should continue to fund these, handful of programs. But on the Senate side, their bill objects to the cuts to STEM education programs, in training programs, et cetera. So there too is a big shift. Looking at NIH, like I said, both the House and Senate, which are under the president's party, rejected the massive cut to NIH and the president's request. Both essentially proposing flat funding for the agency. As part of the president's request for NIH was a major reorganization, which you've probably seen this before, going from 27 institutes and centers down to 8. with not a lot of detail of what that would actually mean. And thankfully, both the House and Senate bill reject the reorganization, so would fund all of the institutes and centers exactly as it has in the past. And the House bill includes language stating that Congress has jurisdiction over the reorganization and reauthorization of the NIH. So you can't, administration, unilaterally change the structure of NIH. You have to work with Congress. So reasserting that power, but then saying, we look forward to working with you on this. So trying to thread a needle there. And the Senate bill just wholesale rejects the proposal to reorganize. There's a lot of interesting things in the NIH bill. And not both bills don't address all of the issues, but keep in mind that again, they're all of the same party. So it's interesting to see this pushback happening. One area is the indirect cost rate. The administration, even though it's been stayed by the courts, is still pushing for a 15% indirect cost rate across the board. And both the House and Senate bills reject that. And you may be familiar with the JAG report. It's a report of scientific and higher ed groups coming up with a new proposal on how to handle indirect costs. And so both the House and Senate reports do cite the JAG report as something that should be part of the discussion, but no decision would be made in the appropriations bills about what to do about indirect costs. Another topic that's hot right now is the administration and NIH leadership's interest in forward funding 50% of its grants in 2026. So they actually started doing this in 2025 this year, which is taking all of the funding for the life of the grant and funding it in year one. They claim that provides more stability and predictability for the people who get their funding. But of course, everyone else is worried about, well, what does that mean for success rates? You're going to fund fewer projects if you're spending all of the grant money in the first year and so on. And so the House bill doesn't mention this proposed policy, but the Senate bill rejects it, but also says you need to produce a study on everything you did in this regard for 2025. We want to see what happened to success rates, who's being funded, who's not being funded. This is a pretty big shift. And so if you want to do this NIH, we need to see more data on how this would work. And then there is report language in the Senate bill on addressing a number of things that the administration has already done. So not related to the budget request, but in response to actions taken earlier this year. So in the area of not obligating funding in a timely manner or holding back funding, issues related to impoundment and some of those terms you may have heard throughout the year. The Senate bill includes language criticizing the administration's slow release of grant funds and asks for additional reporting on what's been released, what the holdup has been, and comparisons to previous years as well in terms of sort of the timeliness of getting funding out the door. Noting that we are coming up to the end of the fiscal year. And so what happens to any funds that the administration has been holding back when the year expires? A lot of questions around that. Another is related to the administration's elimination of federal advisory committees. The NIH has a ton of advisory councils, NSF does too, and the administration eliminated them, except for a handful. And so the Senate report also directs NIH to provide its rationale for that, to talk about which ones are congressionally mandated, because if they are, the administration can't terminate them. So a lot of questions around that. And then questions around the number of political appointees that have been put into federal science agencies. So obviously we saw the purge of federal employees earlier in the year with the reductions in force across the government. And a lot of political appointees being put in these positions. And so the Senate bill is concerned about the lack of technical expertise, particularly at NIH, and asking questions about political interference in the grant making process if you only have politicals serving in these positions. So that's just a sampling of some of the NSF and NIH activities in the House and Senate bills. So you can see how they differ. Just so you can, for completeness, see what the bills say for some of the other agencies that we care about. So the other big proposal in the president's budget this year was a big reorganization of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so you may have heard about the MAHA report, Make America Healthy Again report, the Administration for a Healthy America, or AHA. All of these sort of new structures that the administration wanted to put in place with RFK Jr. Both bills reject the reorganization. The reorganization would have consolidated and moved a lot of programs around. FDA would go into a new part of a new structure and so on. But both the House and Senate bills would continue to fund the HHS agencies as they have been. So some of them pay lip service to the reorganization. We look forward to working with you on this, but not allowing the administration to unilaterally change the structure of HHS. And then you can see on the screen what some of the numbers are for HHS agencies. And this is a bit of a mixed bag. So for CDC, you can see it's kind of like the NSF, where the House doesn't propose quite as big of a cut, but the Senate is essentially flat funding for CDC. So that's a sign that, at least to some degree, the Hill is still in favor of a strong CDC. ARC, which is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which funds healthcare systems research, they would be zeroed out in the House bill. That is not new. We have seen for years and years Republicans, especially in the House, try to zero out ARC because they think it's duplicative of other agencies. Surprisingly, the administration wouldn't zero it out, but the House seeks to. But the Senate would restore funding for ARC. If I had to guess, I would say ARC will probably survive again. It has so far survived all attempts to zero it out over the last couple of decades. And then SAMHSA, which is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, you can see there Congress's support for that agency by close to flat funding proposed in both bills. Department of Education is its own creature. As we all know, this administration would love it that if there wasn't a Department of Education. And we're following those developments, but for appropriations sake, we're closely following the Institute of Education Sciences and the International Education Programs, Title VI and Fulbright-Hays. And so you can see that the president wanted to slash funding for IES, which also funds the National Center for Education Statistics. That's where the nation's report card is funded. Lots of statutorily mandated activities coming out of IES. But the House and Senate both propose flat funding for that agency, which is great. And I know that there has been really strong advocacy for IES this year. So kudos to the community for everything they did to support that agency. For international education programs, not surprising given this president and this administration's position on international programs. The president would zero out Title VI and Fulbright-Hays. The House agrees with that. That too is not unusual. Every couple of years, we do see a zeroing out of these programs, but Congress does tend to like these programs. Title VI centers go to their universities in their states. It's money to their states and their higher ed institutions. So the Senate bill would reinstate that. Interestingly, the Senate report also includes language specifically about the really awful cuts that have been made to IES and NCES, just decimating the agencies through layoffs. So basically just terminating the majority of their employees to the extent that they can no longer conduct the work that they're supposed to conduct. So they're cutting the agency without having to cut the budget. They're operationally stopping the agency from doing its work that it's supposed to do. So the Senate bill raises this concern, and especially raises concern about the ability of these agencies to meet their statutory obligations, nation's report card, other data collection, survey activities, statistical activities, things that they have to do. And if they don't have the staff to do it, how's that going to get done? So Congress asking for more clarity, more information on that. And then this is just to show that it's going to be a tough year for the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the National Institute of Justice, both within DOJ. Both agencies would see cuts. I mean, they're already underfunded. If you followed our reporting on these agencies, they've been hemorrhaging for years and years. It's sort of the product of being inside of an agency that's highly polarized. There's not a lot of attention on these two small research and statistical agencies because there are much bigger things happening in the DOJ. So it's hard to get attention for these agencies. So we're unfortunately preparing for some cuts to these going forward. All right. Well, that was my quick drive-by of what you may have missed over the summer, but I wanted to end by sharing with you a brand new resource that I finalized right before this meeting that hopefully will be of use to you, and I hope that you'll peruse it, but also share it widely. So we have developed an at-home advocacy guide. So we recognize that these are trying times, and if you're not living in the DC area and not steeped in politics, you might think, I want to do something, but I don't know where to start, or advocacy isn't for me, or I'm not allowed to advocate, or whatever it might be. And so our goal with this guide is to show how accessible advocacy can be to anyone, and to take away some of the mystery around advocacy that might be keeping you from engaging in the process yourself. And so it's a 20-page document, really written in simple terms, and it has three main opportunities to engage. And we provide where we can how much time it should take you to do these things to really showcase these are some simple things you can do to have real impact. So level one being just staying informed, learn what's going on, find trusted resources, follow the work of your elected officials so you know what they care about. Level two is things that you can do to dip your toe in the advocacy process. You could respond to an action alert when COSSA sends one to you. You can call a congressional office or write them a letter. Simple things, and we talk about strategies and best ways to do that. And then big actions. We always hear about town hall meetings. What does it actually take to be part of that? And how do you make your question stand out in a town hall meeting so that you get a clear response from the policymaker? And then we include checklists for each of these as well. So you can decide the level to which you want to start advocating. And then as you do them, you can, I don't know about you, I love checklists. So you can check them off and give yourself a gold star for each one of these things. The document also talks a little bit about how to develop your message. So it doesn't assume that we're asking you to advocate for funding. This can be used for any issue that you care about, whether it's social science or not. It's just strategies for how to develop a message that resonates. What does your audience care about? What are they hearing when you're talking to them? And then include some worksheets at the back on how to craft your message in a way that tells a story. We put the link out. Yep, the link is in the chat for this. It's on our website, but we haven't done any promotion for it yet. So you'll be seeing more in our newsletter and other messages about this guide. But please do let us know if you have any questions or feedback. We'd love to hear it. And with that, I do want to, and we have lots of time for questions if there's other topics I didn't get to address. But we do have a speaker for next month. So October 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern, we'll be joined by Wanda Ward from the University of Illinois. She's also a member of the National Science Board, which is the governing body for the National Science Foundation. And she's specifically going to talk about the work of the NSF Commission on Merit Review. So you may recall us reporting in the past that NSF and the National Science Board have been doing a holistic look of the merit review process, which hasn't really been looked at in a decade, both intellectual merit and broader impacts. And they are really close to finalizing their recommendations sometime this month. So we're hopeful by end of October, they'll be ready to talk about it. And so Wanda, who chairs that commission, has agreed to join us. So we hope that you'll join us for that. You know how to find us. So let me pause here. I like to end, this year I started ending each presentation, whether I'm in person or virtual, with a cute dog, because if you can't end on a positive note, at least we can end with a cute face like that. So let me pause and see if there are any questions. Feel free to unmute or raise your hand or put it in the chat. Mackenzie, can you moderate that?
Yeah, of course. So Melissa has a question in the chat. Did these bills/reports say anything about the president's proposed reorganization of BLS to Commerce?
And so, Kenzie, that's a question for you.
Yeah. I was going to say, I can go ahead and answer that. There was not a lot of reorganization included in the bills at all. If I remember correctly, I think it was in the House that they did briefly mention it, but it wasn't included as a proposal to reorganize. So for everyone on the call, reorganization is usually done through authorizing legislation and not through appropriations. And it seems as if that's the kind of route Congress is taking with it anyway as well.
Good question. A lot of things moving around. Hopefully you all are receiving the COSSA Washington update. So you're getting all of these updates as we put them through. If you're not, please reach out.
There's another question in the chat from Mary Jo. Is COSSA aware of any efforts to respond to the administration's cancellation of the current population survey, food security supplement? They're hearing concerns from some members at PAA.
Yeah, Mary Jo, I mean, I would ask you that question. But no, I haven't heard of any community sign-ons or efforts yet on that, but I'd be happy to ask around too with some of the other scientific groups and see. Thanks for raising that. That's the other consideration these days. There's so much happening. We can't keep our eye on all of it. So if you see something, even if it seems really specific to a certain, one survey or one program, flag it for us. Because if we don't know the answer, we can connect with countless other scientific organizations in the advocacy space and see what we can find out. So if we're not talking about something, it's probably just because we didn't see it or, some other reason, but not because it's not important.
There's another question from Denise. Many social scientists work in civil service. Any updates on the civil service reforms?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a really, really hard time to be in government service, as I'm sure you all know. My neighbors on both sides lost their government jobs. There are surprisingly still a lot of social scientists working in government. I say surprising because you would think our sciences would be a target for the administration, but so far that hasn't been the case, at least not intentionally targeting social science. I mean, the reductions in force happened, and even though many people were called back to work, NSF was entirely called back to work, for example, and they don't expect to have more layoffs in the near future, just given lawsuits and things. The administration is not going to back down from a smaller bureaucracy. So I think watch what the courts do and watch what Congress does in their appropriations bills and any directives that they give to the agencies. Because if the final appropriations bills contain language related to the workforce, that is required by the administration to follow. They don't like to follow things, and then it goes through the courts. So it's sort of a backward system right now, but there's a lot disincentivizing people from public service, unfortunately. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Another question from Deborah. How do you see the Gold Science EO or how do you see it being used and what advice would you give to grantees on how to navigate things that we agree with but may be used to reject grants?
Right. That's a good question. The gold standard executive order is a lot less clear than the other executive order I mentioned in terms of like what its ambitions are and what it's trying to achieve. It reads as if it's trying that, if you didn't know any better, it reads that science was the Wild West before, and now we're trying to rein it in and make everything transparent and beautiful. But the actions don't follow that, obviously. Grant terminations, political interference, all the things that fly in the face of those core tenets. I will say I've been pleased to hear from folks who have had grants terminated and then reinstated, or who have been contacted by program officers who want to work with them on changing the language so that it can continue to be funded. I think that's where we're going to be for a while, unfortunately, is getting creative. There are ways to work around some of the bans on certain areas of research. And then there's some that we're just not going to be, the government's not going to be able to fund because we're not going to be able to explain it in any different way. But program officers are still on our side. They want to work with you. They want to fund the good things. And so working with them as much as you can would be my advice. And it's always good to engage with the press office at your university or your institution too, to stop them from having sexy titles to announcements of awards and such, because that is also stuff that gets in trouble when research is mischaracterized in some way. What else? Good questions. All right. Well, I won't keep you. Please do keep in touch. Keep raising issues like this. We have a long list of things that we're tracking. You're looking at the whole team here. So if we don't get to your topic, just raise it for us and we're happy to take a look. Otherwise, we hope to see you next month. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that are going on briefly, and then we'll talk with Wanda Ward about merit review and what's going on with the peer review process. So thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.